When Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor, its objective was to shatter America's resolve and prevent the nation from retaliating with one overwhelming blow. Instead, it failed to accomplish either goal. The assault sank or heavily damaged 7 aging American battleships, but because they were anchored in the harbor at the time, many of their crews survived. All except 2 of those vessels were eventually salvaged, repaired, and returned to service. The attack also spared most of Pearl Harbor's onshore facilities from serious damage. More importantly, the strike on American soil united the nation behind the decision to declare war on Japan. It also forced the U.S. Navy to shift its focus from battleships to aircraft carriers, paving the way for a stronger and more modern fleet in the Pacific yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The aging Lexington and Saratoga, both commissioned in 1927, along with the much newer Enterprise, were away from Pearl Harbor when the attack occurred and escaped unharmed. By 1942, they had been joined by Enterprise's sister ship, Yorktown, as well as the newly commissioned Hornet. These aircraft carriers were designed for offensive warfare, capable of carrying large numbers of powerful fighter aircraft and dive bombers. In 1942, Admiral Chester William Nimitz assumed command as Commander-in-Chief of the Central Pacific Fleet. Within just a few weeks, this exceptional leader had completely restored the morale of his men, inspiring them with his unwavering belief that the Allies would eventually win the war. After taking command, Nimitz launched a series of offensives against Japanese-held islands throughout the Pacific. In addition to disrupting Japanese operations, these missions were intended to keep his sailors motivated while giving them valuable combat experience. At various times, his fleet attacked Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Then, in March, they struck Wake and Marcus Islands. These were by no means small-scale operations, and the destruction inflicted during the first months of 1942 was considerable. Before the war began, Japanese military planners had long feared that American aircraft carriers might one day launch air attacks against Japan itself. That fear became a reality on April 18, 1942, when 16 United States Army B-25 Mitchell bombers carried out a raid on Tokyo. The mission was led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Even more remarkable was the fact that these 12-ton bombers, originally built for land-based operations, successfully took off from the deck of the American aircraft carrier Hornet. The heart of Tokyo came under bombardment. While the physical destruction was relatively limited, the psychological blow dealt to Japan was enormous. Shocked by the attack, the Japanese leadership finally approved Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's bold strategy, a decisive showdown between the Japanese and American fleets. What Yamamoto failed to consider, however, was that his carefully prepared plans would soon become known to the enemy. By the end of April, American intelligence had managed to decrypt nearly 85% of Japanese military communications. This breakthrough gave the United States an extraordinary advantage in the Pacific. Intelligence reports revealed that Japan was preparing a major offensive in the Southwest Pacific. American codebreakers confirmed that Port Moresby was the primary objective, with the Solomon Islands serving as a secondary target. Controlling these positions would allow Japan to dominate and possibly even invade northern Australia. Their strategy was to cut Australia off from the United States by capturing Port Moresby and building a seaplane base on the small island of Tulagi in the Solomons. After that, Japan planned to seize important locations in New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, and Fiji. To support this campaign, they assembled a powerful invasion fleet that included 6 modern destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers, and the large aircraft carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. Together, these carriers carried 133 aircraft. The main invasion force for Port Moresby was scheduled to leave Rabaul while the carrier strike force would sail from Truk in the Caroline Islands, about 1,600 kilometers northeast of New Guinea. The Americans reacted without delay, and the search for the Japanese fleet began. Admiral Chester William Nimitz dispatched a three-part naval force into the Coral Sea. Overall tactical command was given to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the aircraft carrier Yorktown, leading Task Force 17. On May 1, this force joined Task Force 11, commanded by Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, aboard the carrier Lexington, just south of the Solomon Islands. Together, the two carriers carried 141 aircraft and were protected by 5 cruisers and 11 destroyers. Later that same day, they were reinforced by a combined Australian-American group of cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral John Crace. On May 3, Japanese forces captured the small island of Tulagi without facing any resistance. The following day, aircraft from the Yorktown launched an attack. The strike sank 1 destroyer, along with several smaller Japanese vessels. But it also cost the Americans the valuable element of surprise. The Japanese now realized that at least one American aircraft carrier was operating nearby. Throughout May 5 and 6, reconnaissance planes from both sides searched tirelessly for each other's fleets. But neither side managed to make contact. On May 7, the two opposing fleets finally came into contact. But both sides were equally affected by mistakes and unexpected errors. Shortly after 7:00 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance plane reported spotting what appeared to be an American aircraft carrier and a cruiser southwest of Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Takeo Hara, commanding the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, immediately ordered a full-scale strike. 51 dive bombers, protected by 18 Zero fighters, launched the attack. However, the two ships they had identified were actually the tanker US Neosho and an escorting destroyer. They were easy targets. While the attack was in progress, Hara received reports that the real American fleet had been sighted much farther to the northwest. All he could do then was wait nervously for his aircraft to return, but the Japanese were not the only ones to make a costly mistake. At 8:15 a.m., an American reconnaissance aircraft reported seeing 2 Japanese carriers and 4 heavy cruisers just north of Misima Island, near the eastern tip of New Guinea. Convinced he had located the main Japanese fleet, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the Yorktown immediately launched a full-scale attack. 93 aircraft took off from the Yorktown and Lexington. In reality, the pilot had only spotted one of Japan's support groups, made up of 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers. The situation changed thanks to the sharp observation of Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton, commander of Lexington's dive bomber squadron. While flying toward the reported target, Hamilton drifted slightly east of course. Instead of the support group, he discovered a far more valuable target. A covering force protecting the Port Moresby invasion, led by Rear Admiral Aritamo, got aboard the aircraft carrier Shoho. The American aircraft quickly changed course toward this new objective. At first, the highly maneuverable Shoho successfully avoided several attacks. Eventually, however, the overwhelming American assault proved too much, and the carrier was sunk. Meanwhile, Fletcher had ordered the combined Australian-American force, under Rear Admiral John Crace, to intercept the Port Moresby invasion force. Crace's ships were attacked first by Japanese land-based aircraft from Rabaul, and later, by mistake, by American B-26 bombers flying from Australia, which misidentified them as Japanese vessels. Fortunately, neither attack caused serious damage. Another remarkable error by the Japanese also occurred on May 7. 27 Japanese aircraft searching for the American fleet spotted the Yorktown, mistakenly believed it was a Japanese carrier, and even attempted to land on it. 10 of those aircraft were shot down. After learning about the sinking of Shoho and the presence of the Australian-American force near Port Moresby, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the invasion force, decided to postpone the attack on Port Moresby. His first priority would be destroying the American carrier fleet. Early on the morning of May 8, the two carrier fleets finally found each other. After the sinking of Shoho, both sides were left with 2 aircraft carriers each. However, The Japanese had only 95 operational aircraft, while the Americans had 118. Shortly after 9 a.m., both fleets launched their aircraft, and the Battle of the Coral Sea officially began. The Japanese strike caused heavy damage to both the Yorktown and the Lexington. Through skillful maneuvering, Yorktown managed to avoid the incoming torpedoes, but bombs exploding in the water nearby caused serious damage below the waterline. Another bomb crashed through 4 decks before exploding, killing 37 crew members and injuring 33 more. The larger and less agile Lexington was struck by 2 torpedoes along with several bombs, leaving the carrier heavily tilted to its port side. At the same time, American pilots launched their own attack against the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. Zuikaku, the flagship, disappeared behind a heavy rainstorm, forcing the entire American assault onto her sister ship, Shokaku. The few defending Zero fighters managed to make the first wave of American Devastator torpedo bombers release their weapons too early, causing every torpedo to miss. However, the second wave of Dauntless dive bombers proved far more effective. One pilot, Lieutenant John James Powers, had promised to sink an enemy carrier on his own. During the attack on Shokaku, he dived in at extremely low altitude and released his bomb just 19 meters above the carrier's flight deck. Moments later, the explosion sent Powers crashing into the sea, where he lost his life. His sacrifice was not in vain. The bomb severely damaged Shokaku's flight deck, making it impossible for its aircraft to take off or land. Additional bomb hits finished the job, forcing Shokaku to withdraw from the battle. With no air cover remaining, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Ino had no choice but to cancel the entire operation and pull back the invasion force. As a result, the Battle of the Coral Sea became a strategic victory for the Americans. However, the success was overshadowed by a tragic and unexpected disaster. About 2 hours after the final aircraft had returned, Lexington was rocked by a massive internal explosion. Ironically, it was not caused by enemy action, but by a small spark from a generator that had accidentally been left running. Fuel leaking from ruptured tanks quickly fed the flames, turning the carrier into an inferno. Although the crew fought the fire for hours, it was not fully brought under control until the following day. By then, the damage was beyond repair, and the ship had to be abandoned. A total of 2,735 crew members were rescued, but 216 sailors lost their lives. To prevent the burning carrier from falling into enemy hands, an American destroyer finally sank Lexington with a torpedo. By the end of the battle, the Americans had lost 1 aircraft carrier, 1 tanker, and 1 destroyer, while the Japanese lost 1 carrier and 1 destroyer. American casualties totaled 564 sailors and airmen, compared with 1,074 Japanese personnel killed. Japan also lost 77 aircraft, while the United States lost 66. Most importantly, the battle stopped Japan's advance toward Port Moresby and protected Australia from immediate threat. The Battle of the Coral Sea also marked history as the first naval battle in which 2 opposing fleets fought without ever seeing each other directly, relying entirely on aircraft to attack from long distances. The Americans quickly adapted to this new style of naval warfare and were ready to use it again. That next test would come sooner than anyone expected. Japan's admirals were already preparing for another major battle, hoping to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet once and for all. By attacking Midway Atoll, located at the far western edge of the Hawaiian Islands, they believed they could lure the American fleet into open waters and wipe it out. On May 20, 1942, Allied listening stations across the Pacific intercepted a long-coded radio message sent by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to his fleet. The message was forwarded to the American Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor, where it was successfully decoded. It revealed that the Japanese Navy was preparing a massive assault on Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific, while launching a secondary diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands farther north. Dutch Harbor and the Aleutians was scheduled to be attacked on June 3rd, with Midway targeted the following day. Operation MI, the planned attack on Midway, reflected the typical style of Japanese military planning. It was overly complicated, depended on risky assumptions about the enemy's response, and failed to focus its full strength in one place. Even so, the operation might have succeeded if the Americans had not uncovered its secrets beforehand. The decision to attack Midway itself was also questionable. One of Yamamoto's own carrier captains described the mission as both impossible and unnecessary. But while Japan's leaders debated where to strike, recent events had already made the choice for them. The Doolittle Raid on Tokyo in April had exposed the Japanese homeland to attack and even placed their emperor in danger. Humiliated by the raid, Japan's military leaders became convinced that every weakness in the nation's defensive perimeter had to be sealed. Yamamoto's strategy was straightforward in theory. While one part of his fleet attacked Midway, another would launch a diversionary assault on the Aleutian Islands. If Midway were captured, it would become a serious threat to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester William Nimitz would almost certainly try to recapture the island. Waiting for him would be the powerful Japanese Pacific Fleet, supported by aircraft operating from the newly occupied base. Yamamoto hoped to spring the perfect trap and accomplish what had escaped him at Pearl Harbor, the complete destruction of American naval strength in the Pacific. He believed that once Nimitz's fleet had been eliminated, the west coast of the United States would lie exposed to Japanese attack. In his view, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would then have no choice but to seek peace. At least, that was the Japanese expectation. Yamamoto committed nearly the entire Japanese fleet to the operation, 160 warships, including 8 aircraft carriers carrying more than 400 carrier-based aircraft. The fleet was divided into 5 separate battle groups. Leading the attack was the 1st Carrier Striking Force, equipped with 4 aircraft carriers and 225 dive bombers. Their mission was to bombard Midway before an invasion force of 5,000 troops landed from 12 transport ships. The invasion force was protected by 2 supporting groups positioned about 80 kilometers away. Nearly 950 kilometers behind them sailed the main Japanese battle fleet with 7 battleships, ready to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet after the carrier aircraft had delivered the decisive blow. Knowing the odds were heavily against him, Admiral Chester William Nimitz placed all his trust in the aircraft carrier and its ability to strike from long distances. He believed his slower battleships would only slow the operation down, so he ordered them to remain on the United States West Coast. Nimitz organized his fleet into 2 battle groups. Task Force 16, built around the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, and Task Force 17, centered on the carrier Yorktown. On May 28, Task Force 16 sailed from Pearl Harbor. Task Force 17, however, faced an unexpected delay. Having just returned from the Battle of the Coral Sea, Yorktown had suffered serious damage. Repair crews at Pearl Harbor estimated the work would require 3 weeks. Nimitz, however, demanded that the repairs be completed within just 48 hours. Working non-stop day and night, the crews achieved the impossible. On May 30, under the command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, Yorktown sailed from the harbor. Once at sea, Fletcher assumed tactical command of the American fleet. Nimitz gave him one simple instruction: you will be governed by the principle of calculated risk. Thanks to intelligence reports, the American fleet reached its position well before Japanese submarines formed a patrol line west of Hawaii to detect them. Midway Island, a small outpost located halfway between Hawaii and Japan and serving as the gateway to Pearl Harbor, was on full alert. The defenders knew the Japanese fleet was somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden by clouds and distance. Intelligence reports warned that the attack was expected the following day. The island's defenses had been strengthened, and during the previous night, B-17 flying fortresses had arrived at Midway. By 7 a.m., they stood on the runway being refueled. Their bombs were loaded, and every gun was ready. The moment the enemy fleet was located, they would launch an immediate air attack. During a dawn patrol, Ensign Jack Reed was flying a Catalina flying boat from Midway, searching the skies for signs of the approaching Japanese fleet. At 9 a.m., he spotted the transport ships and escorting cruisers of the Japanese invasion force. The sighting was quickly reported to Fletcher aboard the Yorktown. However, this was not the target Fletcher truly wanted. His primary objective remained the Japanese carrier striking force. Instead of committing his carriers, he ordered Midway's B-17 flying fortresses to attack the invasion fleet. As the heavy bombers slowly rolled down the runway, another report reached Fletcher confirming that the Japanese diversionary attack had already begun. Earlier that morning, Japanese forces had launched their assault on the Aleutian Islands. Torpedo bombers and Zero fighters from the carrier Ryujo attacked the American base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. They damaged oil storage tanks, military barracks, the hospital, and even a church. However, inexperienced pilots from the second carrier, Juneau, became lost during the operation. Although American flying boats had already located the Japanese fleet, it remained too far away for either American warships or land-based aircraft to launch an effective attack. Meanwhile, Nimitz was not fooled by the diversion. He refused to send major forces north, keeping his attention fixed on Midway. On June 4, the real target, the Japanese carrier striking force under Admiral Chichi Nagumo, was weaving through thick fog, completely unaware that Fletcher's fleet was waiting in ambush. In the early morning hours, the fog finally cleared, revealing calm seas and clear skies. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched the opening strike. A total of 108 aircraft lifted off from his carriers and headed toward Midway. The incoming aircraft were immediately detected by Midway's radar. As Zero fighters emerged from the clouds, the island's defenses responded without delay. Midway's fighter planes scrambled into the sky to intercept the attackers. Although the Japanese caused considerable damage to buildings and military facilities, the airstrip itself remained untouched. A few transport aircraft were destroyed, but most of the fighters and bombers had already taken off before the raid began. As smoke and flames spread across the island, officials quickly assessed the extent of the damage. Admiral Chichi Nagumo now faced a difficult decision. His first strike had failed to disable the airfield as planned. Since it was still fully operational, another air attack would be necessary. Following Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's orders, Nagumo had kept his most experienced aircrews in reserve, with their aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons in case the American fleet appeared earlier than expected. But his reconnaissance planes had reported no American warships, and he now needed those aircraft to finish the attack on Midway. Before he could decide, however, the Americans made the choice for him. Bombers flying from Midway suddenly appeared overhead and attacked the Japanese fleet. Although they caused no damage, they completely changed the course of the battle. Nagumo immediately ordered his second wave of torpedo bombers to be armed with bombs for another strike against Midway. At 7:28 a.m., only 15 minutes after Nagumo had ordered the aircraft below deck, one of his reconnaissance planes reported sighting 10 American warships about 335 kilometers northeast of the Japanese carriers. Ironically, that scout plane had taken off 30 minutes late that morning. Had it departed on schedule, it would have discovered the American fleet half an hour earlier and delivered its report before the torpedo bombers had been brought below for rearming. If that had happened, Nagumo would almost certainly have launched his aircraft against the American fleet immediately, and the outcome of both the battle and the Pacific War might have been dramatically different. Instead, he found himself facing another impossible decision. Should he focus on the newly discovered American warships or continue preparing the second attack on Midway? He ordered the rearming process to stop. But another question still troubled him. Did the American force include aircraft carriers? His greatest fear became reality at 8:20 a.m., when another scout reported that the enemy fleet appeared to include at least one carrier. The timing of the report could not have been worse for Nagumo. His first wave of aircraft was just returning from the Midway attack and needed to land for refueling. Any bombers still available would have to fly without fighter protection and were armed only with bombs instead of torpedoes. By 9:18 a.m., the Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft, some being rearmed, others refueling. The carriers had effectively become floating bombs. What Nagumo did not know was that Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had already launched his own strike force, and an American attack could arrive at any moment. Earlier that morning at 5:34 a.m., Fletcher had received reports that Catalina flying boats had located the Japanese carrier fleet. He immediately ordered the Hornet and Enterprise to move ahead and attack, while the Yorktown remained behind briefly to recover its reconnaissance aircraft. At 7 a.m., despite being far from the enemy, Hornet and Enterprise launched 152 aircraft toward the Japanese fleet. The pilots knew the enemy would likely be recovering aircraft from the Midway attack, but launching from such extreme range was an enormous gamble. Those airmen were about to carry out what would become one of the most decisive naval airstrikes in history. However, they were unaware that Nagumo had changed course while rearming his aircraft. As a result, the 1st American Strike Group struggled to locate the Japanese fleet. At 9:28 a.m., the first American torpedo bombers from the Hornet finally appeared over the Japanese fleet and immediately began their attack. The Japanese quickly launched their Zero fighters, determined to drive the American torpedo bombers away from the fleet, and a fierce battle erupted in the skies. By 9:45 a.m., another wave of torpedo bombers from the Enterprise arrived, followed at 10:15 a.m. by aircraft from the Yorktown. American losses were devastating. Japanese Zero fighters, combined with intense anti-aircraft fire from the ships below, cut through the attacking formations. Only 4 aircraft from the Enterprise's first wave managed to return to their carrier. The crews from Hornet and Yorktown suffered similar losses. Even those who made it back still faced the dangerous task of landing heavily damaged aircraft on the pitching deck of a moving carrier. Some pilots were not as fortunate. Others landed with their planes engulfed in flames. Amazingly, several of them survived. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. searched the vast blue waters northeast of Midway Island. Leading 33 Enterprise dive bombers, he had lost sight of the enemy. He now faced a critical decision. The location where he expected to find the Japanese fleet was empty, and his aircraft were rapidly running low on fuel. Instead of turning back, McCluskey trusted his instincts and continued searching farther west. It was a gamble that changed history. Admiral Chester William Nimitz later called it the most important decision of the entire battle. Minutes later, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer and followed it. Shortly after 10 a.m., he finally located the Japanese carriers. Earlier American torpedo bomber attacks had suffered terrible losses, with most aircraft destroyed by Japanese fighters. Yet those sacrifices had pulled the Zeros down to low altitude, allowing McCluskey's dive bombers to approach completely unnoticed. Joined by another 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown, McCluskey arrived at the perfect moment. Nearly 100 Japanese aircraft crowded the carrier decks, fully loaded with bombs and high-octane fuel, as they prepared for their own strike against the American fleet. The carriers had become floating powder kegs, where even a single spark could trigger disaster. Just as the Japanese ships turned into the wind to launch their aircraft, 50 American dive bombers plunged from the sky. Within minutes, direct hits transformed the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu into blazing infernos. One Japanese sailor later recalled, "The terrifying scream of the dive bomber reached me first, followed by the crashing explosion of a direct hit. There was a blinding flash, and then a second explosion much louder than the first." In only a few moments, the core of Japan's first air fleet had been destroyed. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial attack and immediately launched a desperate counterstrike. At 12 p.m., her aircraft attacked the Yorktown. Despite desperate evasive maneuvers, the American carrier suffered several direct bomb hits. Even with her powerful engines allowing sharp turns at full rudder, Yorktown could not avoid every attack. Bombs exploded close alongside, shaking the entire ship and throwing aircraft into the air across the flight deck. The crew fought desperately to save the carrier, but their efforts could not overcome the damage. By 2:40 p.m., after another torpedo struck home, Yorktown was crippled beyond recovery. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had no choice but to abandon the ship and transferred command to Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of Task Force 16 Tot. At 5 p.m., Spruance launched aircraft from the Hornet and Enterprise with one clear objective: to destroy Hiryu. The attack caught the Japanese completely by surprise. Once again, aircraft crowded the flight deck as the carrier prepared for an evening strike against the remaining American fleet. 4 direct bomb hits set the decks ablaze, leaving Hiryu beyond repair. During the night of June 4, while crews aboard Hornet and Enterprise prepared for another day of battle, the damaged carriers Soryu and Kaga slipped beneath the waves. As dawn broke on June 5, reports reached the American fleet that the still-burning Hiryu was rapidly sinking. Soon afterward came confirmation that Akagi had also followed the same fate. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 of its finest aircraft carriers. On June 6, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto finally ordered a general withdrawal. Before the Japanese fleet could escape, however, American aircraft attacked 2 Japanese cruisers, sinking one and heavily damaging the other. On the morning of June 7, damage control teams returned aboard the Yorktown in a final attempt to save the carrier. Their efforts were cut short when a Japanese submarine struck with torpedoes, sending the badly damaged ship to the bottom of the ocean. That same day, Japanese forces landed on the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, capturing little more than a small weather station. These 2 westernmost islands in the Aleutian chain were so remote that they held very little strategic value for the Americans. In fact, it took 4 days before the United States even realized the islands had been occupied. And even then, no immediate attempt was made to retake them, although both Japan and the United States claimed victory after the earlier Battle of the Coral Sea. There was no doubt about the outcome at Midway. The United States had destroyed Japan's main carrier striking force, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and 1 heavy cruiser, while eliminating 3 22 aircraft and nearly 5,000 officers and sailors. Instead of destroying the United States Pacific Fleet as Yamamoto had promised, Japan suffered one of the greatest defeats in its naval history. As has happened many times throughout military history, the Americans achieved victory against an opponent that was stronger on paper. While the Japanese campaign was weakened by flawed planning, tactical mistakes, and unfortunate circumstances, the Americans benefited from outstanding intelligence, superior naval air coordination, effective battlefield leadership, and, perhaps most importantly, a significant measure of luck. Despite losing 1 aircraft carrier, 137 aircraft, and 307 servicemen, the United States had successfully turned the tide of the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japan could no longer risk another decisive fleet-to-fleet battle and was forced onto the defensive. By the time Japan managed to rebuild its navy, America's full industrial and military strength had already been unleashed, creating the overwhelming power that Yamamoto had always feared.